Well, hello everyone and welcome. We will get started. We still have some people still joining us, and but we'll jump right in. So good afternoon, and thanks for being here. My name is Dana Textoris, and I'm Managing Director at Grants Plus. And with me today is Jessica Salyers, Engagement Strategist, and all of you. And we're so happy to have you join us for this final webinar that Grants Plus is providing in 2020. Now, as we get started, know that you are all muted, but we still want to hear from you. So you'll see that there is a Q&A feature in your screen. At any time, submit your questions, and we'll be eager to get to them as we move to a later portion of the presentation. Also, a bit about us. So many of you may know Grants Plus because you've joined us in these webinars over this last year, and we're so glad that you're part of this community. You may not know that Grants Plus also works directly with nonprofit organizations as our clients. And so as you're making your plans for 2021, please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you'd like information about how Grants Plus can help you make the very most of your grant seeking in the new year. There are lots of ways and options and different budget levels that we would love to be helpful to you. So you are all here because you want to be as successful as you can at winning grants for your organization. And part of that success comes from having the most compelling and persuasive grant proposals. But to do that and create a winning story, we must start with acknowledging all of the factors, some out of our control, that influence funders' grant-making decisions and whether or not your organization gets the grant. The approach that you took a year ago in a totally different context is not the approach that's going to help you be successful today. So we must ground ourselves in understanding where we've been and where we're going in order to prepare a winning grants game plan and a winning grant proposal for 2021. So what has the context been in 2020? I'd say it was a mudslide that crashed down, taking us by surprise, and it transformed everything around us, including our grant seeking. Indeed, this year, the grant landscape has completely shifted under our feet. So one, of course, the COVID pandemic created a crush of unanticipated needs in our communities. And that included a whole host of changes, job losses, income insecurity, and then increased basic needs, food, shelter, shutdown of schools and workplaces, which created an unanticipated need for childcare and other solutions for families, and emergency healthcare needs, of course, for both intervention and prevention services. And what this did in response is that organizations had to pivot, and they had to do it immediately. That meant human service organizations had to quickly figure out how to deliver emergency services. Other organizations, say schools, suddenly providing lunches to hungry students working at home, or learning at home, they had to figure out how to respond too. And virtually every organization faced changes, from total program disruptions to finding new ways of engaging audiences and keeping their donors involved, staff furloughs, losses, other changes and consequences that are still unfolding right now. In morphing how so many organizations fulfill their missions. And this, in response, required that funders pivot too. Foundations were, of course, impacted by many of the same challenges that nonprofits faced, and they too had unprecedented needs that they needed to help fill. So what happened in this context of emergency is that many funders responded in real time to meet these changing needs. Many funders across the country, from community foundations to the largest major foundations in the country, quickly mounted a response to the COVID crisis. And many of these funders established emergency COVID funds from which they've distributed more than $16 billion in emergency COVID funding to thousands of organizations across the country. And then months later, many foundations mounted a second emergency response following the murder of George Floyd. And now, while systemic racism is sadly not at all a new emergency, the resulting protests and calls for justice that have erupted around the country have inspired a significant and overdue commitment to grant making for racial justice. And our team at Grants Plus has invested our expertise and time to create emergency grant seeking resources that are related to both of these emergencies, COVID grants and racial justice grants. And these are resources that we'll be sure to share with you after today's webinar. But what we know from doing this research and tracking the emergence of these emergency grants is that not all organizations benefited equally. For example, human service organizations received a large share of COVID relief funds, and there are many arts organizations, for example, that are struggling as revenues plummet. But the truth is that grant making and philanthropy isn't a democratic process, and this unevenness across our sector is a part of our real context. So what you can do is to understand and move proactively and strategically within your organization's true context to do as much as possible to maximize the funder relationships and the opportunities that are realistically available to your organization. So how do we move proactively and strategically to shift from this context of 2020 into a new context in 2021? One is that we have to acknowledge that the mode we've been engaging with funders in is not the same mode that is going to serve us best in 2021. So we need to acknowledge we're moving from this space of unexpected crisis where funders understood that organizations were hit with the unknown to moving towards an extended new normal, which means that we must demonstrate to funders that we're using our experience of this past year and the perspective we've gained to anticipate what our organizations will need and what role we will prepare to play. Similarly, we're moving from unplanned, unexpected emergency expenditures to having perspective to be planful about the costs that are going to allow our organizations to carry out an adapted version of our organization's programs and services. And finally, while we never, of course, could take our existing funders for granted, previously we had some confidence to know that if we maintained good relationships with our funders, we had, some chance of anticipating continued support. But we're moving into a context that's more uncertain. Many funders are reevaluating their priorities, and that means your former funders might be shifting funds elsewhere. Also, there may be brand new opportunities for your organization to pursue. So this means the same old story from the past, or even from what you have right now, is just simply not going to suffice. There's simply too much change happening and too much that will continue. Some of these changes and more of this context that we can expect in 2021 is that grants are going to be more competitive. So many organizations had special events canceled, revenue disrupted. More organizations are turning to grants. So you have to go into it knowing it's a competitive marketplace. Secondly, you cannot assume that funders understand your relevance. You must be ready to make the very strongest case for why your organization's work is urgent, important, and deserving of funding now. And today we're going to go into some specific advice for doing just that. And then finally, be prepared that funders are grappling too with how to be relevant, and many are reevaluating their priorities. And that sometimes means also changing their guidelines, changing their expectations. So you have to be prepared to anticipate those changes. So what are we going to help you with today? We're going to prepare you to enter this new context in 2021 with confidence and purpose, to tell the most compelling, relevant story to funders about your organization. That's going to help you maximize your grant success in the continuing context of COVID, demonstrate your organization's response to the racial reckoning that's happening in our sector, where you can be proactive to control your narrative, and where you need to be ready to respond to new expectations from funders. So Jessica is now going to lead us into how you go about acknowledging the context of COVID as this first part of rewriting your story for the new normal.
Thanks, Dana. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you that might be still facing morning time here. So yeah, we're going to go on here talking about the context of rewriting our stories in the face of COVID as we look into 2021. At this point, we have all come to the realization that COVID isn't going anywhere. It's at least not going away as quickly as we had hoped it would. And we are now recognizing that in the importance of addressing the effects it's had on our organization, its programs and services, and particularly the populations that we serve. So COVID funding is, we're kind of in a spot where it's shifting from crisis to recovery. So as we continue in our new normal, we're now noticing that the initial COVID emergency funds that have largely been expended, and many funders are offering, they were offering one-time emergency funds, and they may not be renewing that support. And some of us are now even being asked to think about providing reports on how that initial round of funding has been spent. So we have noticed that there are a few funders who are releasing a second round of funding as the pandemic continues to move forward. However, the opportunities are more limited than they were earlier in the year. We are seeing some funders supporting recovery, but this may, the idea of this recovery support may go backwards a bit as the COVID cases and as deaths continue to rise, and our governors, even as of today, are announcing more shutdowns and restrictions, and more individuals in many sectors are unable to work. So we're not quite sure, what that's going to look like in the future. We're also seeing many funders are vowing to continue to support nonprofits that they funded prior to the crisis. So this is kind of proving that the emergency COVID support that they provided initially may not be something that they're planning to continue on with, but they are planning to support those nonprofits that they held near and dear to their hearts prior to the crisis beginning. So in continuing on, Dana mentioned, don't assume that funders know your story or that they know your relevance or your importance. So it's going to be really important as you rewrite your story to be very clear in explaining how your organization has been impacted by COVID-19. And this should be specific to your organization as a whole, as you think about the bigger, larger picture, but then also as you think about your programs and services that you may be writing for specifically. So for example, did you lose fundraising revenue? Did your need for services increase? Did you have to cancel specific aspects of your programming? And then you're going to go into the description of how you responded to these impacts that your organization has faced. So did you host a virtual event in lieu of an in-person gathering? Did your team pivot to providing services via telehealth when in-person wasn't an option? Has your organization faced furloughs? Things like that. You're going to go into describing what your organization has gone through and what you've done to address these urgent needs. And then you're also going to take your best stab at being persuasive. So persuade your reader as to why you are relevant and deserving of these funds that are in high demand right now. So continuing in being as proactive as possible, we have a client who is a major performing arts organization in Atlanta. And one thing that we helped this organization to do is convene their staff in having an intentional dialogue about how the pandemic has affected each of their programs. So this was being proactive and doing this prior to actually having an opportunity in front of them that would have forced their group to come together and have these conversations. They actually did it in advance. And as a group, they identified how program income and expenses have been impacted, how the engagement of their participants and audiences has changed, and what that means for their organization in the short term and in the long term. They also discussed how program delivery will change. And then we worked together to write this out into a narrative that had already been approved now by program staff and supervisors, so that the language is already there. We've already got testimonials to pull from, photographs to prove what this organization has been through since March, metrics that they've been collecting. And it's been very efficient to have this in advance and to be able to pull from these case statements as opportunities present themselves. This has allowed their team to avoid asking staff to take the time as each opportunity comes up. And then continuing on, an example of being proactive, you're going to want to use data to demonstrate your COVID relevance. And data can come from internal data that your organization has worked to collect that's relevant to your specific mission and population, or you can pull from external sources. We know that every day in the news, we're hearing stats about it may be the mental health that's being affected by COVID-19, all different kinds of data. So you could use internal or external sources. So here we have a client that provides senior living homes throughout Ohio, and we have helped them incorporate data very prominently into every grant proposal that they are writing for an opportunity that they're pursuing, to explain the unfortunate reality that many of their senior residents and staff have been infected by COVID-19 or have even unfortunately passed away from the virus. So this language is sobering, but we know it's honest, and it powerfully underscores how the organization is persevering as they face these challenges. So using data like this is really important in being proactive and in rewriting your nonprofit story. And also being proactive, we have found it very beneficial to share if-then scenarios with funders. So funders are very aware that we can't predict the future, but they also can't help themselves from wondering, what if things don't go as we have planned? So what if we write this whole proposal for our plan for maybe the spring of 2021 and things just don't work out that way because maybe the pandemic is getting worse instead of getting better. So presenting them with if-then scenarios. So for example, if our 2021 fundraising gala cannot be held in person, then we have a plan to raise revenues through a virtual auction. Or if our hunger center cannot serve meals on site, then we'll shift to a food delivery model to feed hungry families. And as much detail as you can provide, that's best for each funder. And then telling your budget story. This has become extremely important in being able to show funders the effect that the pandemic has had on your organization. It's actually a visual. So even doing things like showing what your planned budget was, and then showing what your budget actually looks like now in the face of the pandemic allows funders to look at how your organization has been impacted. So they read about it in your narrative, but they can actually see in reality what your budget looks like and how you're being affected. So it may be able to help them understand your income and fundraising losses, program expenses, whether they be increases or decreases, and any redistribution of funding or shifting of priorities. So for an example here, we have a client who's a drug treatment and recovery organization, and they are operating so in the moment that they don't always share or even recognize the full impact of the pandemic. For example, they recently mentioned that they had to hire a cleaning company to sanitize their treatment facilities, and the cost of the service is more than $100,000 for the year. So it may be a minor detail, but it has major financial implications. And be ready to respond to questions about financial stability. We have seen, this is just one example, but we have seen recently that foundations, big or small, are starting to introduce new requirements. So there may be some questions in the narrative, but we're also seeing financial requirements. So PNC Foundation, for example, is now asking potential grantees to describe how their organization and program will continue on in the next fiscal year, given the pandemic and the future disruptions, and asking grantees to provide a 13-week cash flow projection for the organization. So this is just an example of the real things that we're seeing and to try to be prepared for. I'm going to turn it over to Dana to go into racial reckoning in our sector.
Great. So yes, Jessica just shared with us so many of the realities that the COVID crisis causes us to think about. And it's not, our context in 2021 will not only be informed by the continuing pandemic, also the continuing emergency of systemic racism, and the response of both funders and organizations is going to shape our context as well. And it's something that we can be prepared for. So first, we discussed earlier that we have seen funders mount a response to make racial justice grants. And as we have been gathering research, as we've been observing what's happening, we're seeing, one, grants being made for organizations that are doing external work to combat injustice and dismantle structural racism. And this includes an overdue focus on funding Black-led organizations. These are the grants that we've been tracking in our Grants Plus Racial Justice Grant Resource Center. And so any organization that's joining us today, please check the list of grant opportunities that we've gathered there. We also have seen that there are grants being made for organizations that are doing internal work to establish or accelerate their intentional diversity, equity, inclusion, and access efforts. So one question that we've had is, well, is this new? Is this new grant making? And of course, there are funders that have been funding racial equity well before 2020. But we have seen that many funders are emerging to make racial justice a focus of their grant making for the first time. And many organizations doing this work would say it's about time. So what this means for us is that we can acknowledge that there are funders who are familiar, who are experienced, who have been deeply committed and engaged with organizations doing racial justice work. However, there are also funders who simply don't have this expertise and experience. And so what we hope to see is that funders who are newly stepping into this space will do so with a humbleness and an openness to listen and to learn. With that acknowledgement of the need to listen and learn, there's an opportunity here for nonprofits to challenge and shape how funders approach their grant making. So let's look at some of the ways that we see nonprofits holding funders accountable, or we see these conversations happening. Well, one thing we know is that there is a necessity that funders make this a sustained commitment. Borealis Philanthropy, which is one of the funders who's long invested in racial justice movements, has warned that there was a similar moment following the death of Michael Brown in 2014 when funders responded to make grants for racial justice. But what happened at that point was that many funders gradually lost, or they diluted that focus as time passed. And what we know is that combating racism is work that needs to be, this is an investment that needs to be sustained, because this is work that can't be measured and tidily wrapped up in a bow at the end of a single funding year. This is work that must happen, and it will require funders to tolerate a long-term funding commitment and a different approach to grant making. This has also opened up an awareness of the need to challenge and undo power dynamics in philanthropy. and the relationships between funders and grantees. And we're seeing lots of places where funders are grappling with this. And that includes funders who are either making changes or being asked to make changes to make multi-year unrestricted grants, to simplify their processes, to be more flexible in their expectations for measuring progress. Funders are also being held accountable for what we can see have been inequities in grant making. A recent report, this is one report of others, was published by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and it showed that organizations led by people of color have been awarded less grant money. And much of this is because there's been less trust in the decisions that these organizational leaders make from their funders. So, you know, we are glad to see that this is a moment of opportunity and openness and challenge. And some of that is coming from funders themselves. So funders are also holding other funders accountable. So we hope to see this continue. It's also very important that you recognize that more funders are going to expect to see that you have a DEIA plan. These are just a couple of examples of the expectations, but also the penalties that may not come from addressing this. And so if you haven't addressed it, you do it at your own peril. And another thing that we wanted to leave you with today is that there's another way to be proactive, and that is how you use language in your grant proposals and how you embrace more equitable language. We did an entire webinar about this that we encourage you to listen to if you weren't a part of, but some of the guidance that we give is to use person-centered language, that a person is not homeless. A person is experiencing homelessness, that we should ask the people we serve how they define and describe themselves and use that language, that we should be specific and not vague and avoid euphemisms like at risk or underserved. If our organization serves the people in the Black community, let's use the language so we are properly identifying who is experiencing not only the symptoms of racism, but dealing in the systems. So today we want to leave you with these reminders that you can take proactive steps and you can be more prepared to engage with funders and to make the most compelling case by rewriting your story for a changing context in 2021. We have just a couple of minutes. And so I want to answer some of the questions here that have come in. And Margaret has asked, do you think more funders will be open-minded to general operating grants in 2021? I think this is a really good question. I think it is a place where we're seeing a lot of discussion and dialogue about the ways that funders can demonstrate trust with their grantees. They can engage in a different way by making multi-year grants that allow more flexibility and allow organizations to be more planful and really to create the own terms for the changes that they're striving to make. So I think that the jury is out, but we do see that there's a shift that we hope will continue, that more funders will be open to making general operating grants. Can you give an example of terminology to replace terms like homeless or at risk? Yes, I think a big part of it is to be more specific. When we say someone's at risk, what does that really mean? It would be much more compelling to be more specific and say, the students in our community face educational barriers to their success. So let's talk about the actual challenges that they face instead of just labeling them in a way that doesn't actually place responsibility anywhere. And Jane, you've asked this question. We will share some resources after the webinar that will go into much more detail. Please share the name of the webinar that addresses, yes. Terry, thank you for asking about the webinar. We did a webinar called Check Your Labels. That was all about the language choices we make in grant proposals. We will include a direct link to that webinar recording so that you can watch that, as well as a one-pager that sums up our recommendations around equitable language. So I'm sad to say our time has ended, but be on the lookout for a recording and more resources. And please email us if there's any way that we can be a help to you. So thanks so much for joining us today.